Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about some news that's come out recently that sadly Jupiter's Legacy got canceled on Netflix. Normally this would be a bring it back, but there's like an interesting and complicated circumstance with Jupiter's Legacy. So in the grand scheme of things, the show was canceled. There's a lot of contributing factors to it, like, you know, maybe it's just kind of like the declining viewership, plus the show wasn't the most well received. Like, even with like the limited amount of like different like nerdy outlets I kind of listen to and stuff like that, just for like nerdy news and stuff like that, I've only come across maybe one like that was kind of like positive. Not saying like there's only one group out there that's had like a positive reception to the show. Like, it was received positively in some regards, but my experience of what I've come across has mainly been like people who didn't enjoy the show. I personally did, but you know, to each their own, right? But the reason why, because the way I heard it from someone who is more familiar with the comic books, that basically like the whole backstory stuff that they set up, like all the stuff that's like super far in the past and stuff like that, it seems like none of that really came up in the comic book. That seemed like that was something specific to the show. So really, they never really got to a lot of the meat and potatoes of what the show is. Like, some of like the greater points I think earlier on in the show that might have hooked people weren't necessarily 100% a part of the first season just because of that. So I think that plays a contributing factor in it, which, you know, that in itself is a whole conversation, because we may not have gotten it live action wise with this adaptation, sadly, but it is based on a comic book. So to anyone much like myself who isn't familiar with the story and wants to, you know, see the story continue, it does exist as a comic book. Like, I'm sure there were probably some differences between the adaptation and stuff like that, but still, like, at least the story exists in some other format. So it's not like we're completely wondering like, oh, what would have happened next. It still would have been dope as someone who hadn't experienced the story to be able to see it live action wise and stuff like that. But regardless, that's a tangent within itself. But because it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Preacher situation. As someone who had never read the graphic novel and still currently hasn't, of Preacher, my understanding, and this is something I'd read like after season 1 had ended, that basically I think or maybe this was a little after season 2 had premiered, that basically where season 1 of Preacher ends and kind of where season 2 begins is where the graphic novel actually starts, like where you're basically in the middle of everything. Granted, they made a lot of changes to Preacher. Like, I think the way an article described it is, if you basically took the most broad strokes of what Preacher, the graphic novel, is about, and that's kind of what the TV show is, it didn't adapt a lot of certain storylines, or just kind of left out, and I'm sure it just did its own things for the TV show. Regardless, I am a big fan of the Preacher show. I know I've heard from people who read the graphic novel who didn't necessarily feel the same way, understandably, but it kind of reminded me of that, where it's like the season 1 was kind of its own thing. It was very specific to the TV show. It seemed like Jupiter's Legacy kind of did like a similar thing. Now, the reason why I'm going on to this huge tangent and stuff like that, the reason why I'm saying it's a little bit different with the Bring It Back, is because they are continuing going forward with a new kind of spin-off to it called Supercrooks. Basically, it's going to focus on supervillains just doing supervillain things in that same continuity, in that world of Jupiter's Legacy, because this is all part of like Mark Millar's like comic books, you know, like because he ended up making a deal with Netflix where they're adapting a lot of his stuff, and Supercrooks is another comic book he wrote. But the way it's understood to me is that Supercrooks and Jupiter's Legacy, comic book wise, don't take place in the same universe. They're doing it for the TV shows, where Supercrooks is going to be set in the Jupiter's Legacy's universe, so you're kind of continuing on in that world, just not following the story that we were following beforehand, which is kind of interesting, but also a little sad, because it is kind of that thing of knowing like, right, we're going to be in that world, but any of that story that was set up that we were left off with a huge cliffhanger with in season 1 of Jupiter's Legacy, we're just kind of ignoring that, and kind of, it's almost like a soft reboot to a certain extent, which I think is kind of interesting. So I think that's fascinating. So that's why it's in this weird place of, yes, Jupiter's Legacy was canceled, but because what I'd heard was like, my understanding initially was like they had canceled it for now, in the sense that eventually they were going to come back to it after they had reworked it. Because I know some shows have done that, like after their first seasons, like things aren't quite right, so they rework it like season 2 on, and it kind of changes a little bit. I was kind of at first under the impression they were kind of doing something like that, but I think Supercrooks is technically their soft reboot, sort of like reworking of that universe and that world. So they'll probably learn from Jupiter's Legacy and kind of shift things a little bit, because we also learned like Jupiter's Legacy was like a fairly expensive show. Like, some of the stuff coming out was like, oh, it was like $200 million budget. It's a whole thing. But like I said, I'm bummed, but also interested to see where they go. So that's why I didn't quite do this as a bring it back and just kind of had this as kind of like just a nerd mode broken down just discussion, because I thought that was fascinating, because I've never really heard of a show necessarily doing, especially something Netflix wise, because when Netflix cancels something, it's done. Like, it's never like a, oh, we're going to bring it back thing. It's like, no, when they made that decision, they made the decision, because Netflix is usually the spot of, oh, well, other streamers have become this as well. Amazon Prime to a certain extent, because they have the Expanse. But it's like that thing of like, oh, if something's over with, maybe it can have a second life on Netflix. Like, obviously, like The Killing and Lucifer and Longmire are a few examples of that, you know? So... But once again, it is a bummer that Jupiter's Legacy got canceled. Like I said, I enjoyed it, but not everyone did. But once again, the silver lining is the comic book does exist. So if I, continuing and wanting to know like what happens next, me as well as anyone else, invested could check it out. I mean, it's also a bummer for those people who are fans of the comic book who did want to see what a live adaptation would have looked like. Like, I'm sure for them it's kind of a bummer, or maybe it's like, oh, they didn't enjoy it. Like I said, that always, it's a conversation within itself. But yeah, like I said, it's just an interesting circumstance. I'd actually love to get to know your thoughts in the comments down below. First and foremost, did you enjoy Jupiter's Legacies? Why not? And how do you feel about this news about the cancellation, but also them continuing forward with the Supercrooks, making that take place in the same universe, even though comic book wise they don't? Like, how do you feel about all of that? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, light to the force, and enjoy it. Good day and good